Cunnisty, how are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelit Tales podcast, where we tell Irish myths set to original music. This episode continues our series on the Fianna with the story of Cumhail. To listen to our reflections and chats and support this podcast, you can join our Candlelit crew following the links in the show notes. But for now, Aaron, tell us a story.
Cumhail blinked his eyes open. He felt the cold ground underneath his back. He was stiff and sore from activity the day before. His body needed stretching. But he stayed in his covers, blinking his eyes open as he felt the light leaking in across the forests he slept in. Suddenly the bird's song came to his ears, as if this was his waking up song. He woke and stretched his arms out of his blanket, stretching his arms high, his fingers towards the sky and the oak leaves that speckled around his vision. Resting underneath the king of the forest, he thought, was the best place he could have slept last night. He looked down. A woman of the Fianna. Well, she slept happily still. He was proud to be the leader of this Fiann, this band of warriors. His name, Cumhail MacTrainver, son of the great strong one, small king, always in subservience and always bowing his head to Cumhail the Cock, the king of all Ireland. As Cumhail stretched and walked out amongst the forest, the leaves all around him green and glowing in that golden early light, and the birds singing with delight for the sun that's rising, he came to the water's edge, a fast-flowing river where they had made a pool, dug down deep enough to make sure they could submerge a whole hog, and cordoned off with wood to make sure it didn't float away. They'd heated it the night before with great stones, boiling the flesh until the smell of it came to their nostrils. They'd feasted well. The wild boar had been hard to catch. He was still stiff from taking it down. No matter how many of these wild boars they seemed to take down, he always seemed to need more training, to be faster, more agile, quicker. Surely there was an easier way. But he was delighted with how they had managed this. And as he stretched in that morning sunlight, his naked skin soaking in the warmth, his feet now wading into the water, he splashed himself with cold, bracing, icy water fast flowing all around him. He knew he was at home in the wilderness. Cumhail was not one for studying. His father was studious, strong and agile, but he was subservient to the King of Ireland. And he had lands, but he didn't have a lot of lands. And so he had agreed to allow his son Cumhail off to join a faction, a Fiann, as was the custom. He was disappointed when his son did not return. Not 1 year, not 2, but 3 years had gone by before he had even come close to seeing him again. He had sent him messages. None really returned. He was beginning to wonder, would he ever see his son again? He had trained him and taught him everything he could possibly ask. All of the well-known scholars and Well-known bards of the land had taught his son the stories, the ways, the customs, and the great trainings, of course. He was far more interested, he thought, in the combat sports, the great games of hurling too. But he had not seen his son for a very long time. Ull stiffened. Thinking of his father sent a shiver down his spine. Thinking of those cold castles, no matter how warm the sun was, it would not heat those rooms. Staying inside, talking about trade, cattle, feeding pigs in dirty sties, watching their tusks fall. Wild boars were the ones to hunt. Wild game, deer in the open plains and the forests. That was what set Ull's heart alight with laughter and longing to be around it. But every winter it was difficult, and more difficult. More people were gathering under Clan Bashna, this famous faction he was creating. He wasn't the only one who didn't want to return to this weak society, this plaintive, pleading, immoral group who only farmed the land, who forgot what it was to be of the land, in communion with the ways of the winter, summer, spring, and autumn. How to manage yourself. The land taught you if you listened. Ull always thought. His teachers under his father's guidance always instructed him to watch and to listen. But he looked in their eyes and realized they didn't listen. They weren't listening to the heartbeat of the landscape. They were listening to orders and commands. There was nothing about his old teachers that commanded his respect. And yet, he was like his father, strong, with a great voice. He was always disappointed when Trenmor, the strong, great one, would bow his head for Concaith Cog. He had won 100 battles, yes, but there was surely more fight in his father, Ull had thought. Still, it wasn't his place to be in these halls, not during the summer. He loved being in and amongst this wildness of Ireland. And so it was that he was training with the best, because the best found him after he abandoned society and lived off of this land. There was Clan Morna. He'd heard of them, sure. Reckless Aid, wandering around, the brute of a man he'd heard he was, but no. Ull thought if there was a rising tide of young warriors wanting to lead a life outside of castle walls and pigsties, mud huts, they would survive in unison, training greatly, stretching each morning, seeing the water and feeling the cold bite, to wake them up to move in amongst the trees like the great deers, darting like the foxes, hunting like the wolves, being eager and patient like the birds in the trees. Now their singing seemed to die as the sun was bright and rising high. He knew it was time to start a hunt again. They had enough. They had enough for now. But you must hunt during the summer. He knew this because the winters were cold and the winters were harsh. And it was far easier to be allowed into a great home, a hostel, a great castle, if you brought some provisions with you, supplied arms, strength, songs, stories, music, and it always helped to have some wild game. Venison, lean meat, cut to choice, beautifully cured and dried. There was ways to skin the hides to warm themselves as well. All of this he learnt, and he taught, and he trained those around him. All were eager to learn. Far more he learned through doing than the teachers of his father in their cold castles. But he had found one thing they all needed to do: to let each other know if there was a fight happening, if there was any way in which they could help each other out. Well, he looked and he watched, and he had seen the birds communicate. One would tweet, one from the far branches would hear it and call, and suddenly the whole forest was filled with birdsong. And so he imitated this: a great hum, a call, a bellow and a roar, starting with the lips. He called it the Dord Fianna, and when one of their men or women call, it would be up to the next person, as close in earshot as they could be, to then call, starting with their lips, using their belly and their breath, and bellowing as loud and as far as they could call, until all of the forests reverberated with the Dord Fianna. This was their battle call. This was Ull's instructions. And people got to know who Ull was by sight of him alone. He was tall, but he inspired others. He knew it too. Ull was much like his father in his speaking and his grace, but better, he knew it. Strong of limb, but strong of voice and heart as well. And everything he did was to bring people together for a greater purpose, a purpose of belonging with this land, of being connected to the great trees of the forests, not just to chop them down and use their wood, but to be next to them and hear their thrum, their beat. Softer than his own heartbeat, but there nonetheless, he'd said. A sense of it, a sense of aliveness underneath the ground. Fitja fuitja, everything interconnected in the forests, in the land, in the air itself. And so it was time to hunt, his favourite time, and when he ran with the Fianna, his Fianna, Clan Bashkna, and he knew every one of them would not disturb a single branch in the forest nor a bird in the tree for the lightness of their leaping and their precision of their landing. They were so agile, trained every day under Ull's instructions. And they were quiet and soft, slick and swift, and they ran through this forest. Ull caught the track of a deer, noticing its hair first, its hoof prints in the forest floor, and then he darted around to see it there. He sensed it might dash. He let fly his spear, and it fell over, breathing its last breath before it died. Then he noticed someone else. He stayed beside the tree until he heard the call. It sounded rough. It sounded cumbersome. Midlands, he thought. But he answered his name, Ull of Clan Bashkna, and sure enough, it was the other fighting faction, the other Morna. Ed McMorna revealed himself. They were hunting the same deer, and there he was, short of stature, but as thick as he was tall, arms robust and round, sturdy, stout legs, a chest as wide as a barrel. He would not win a wrestling match, but for all of his strength it was clear Ull knew his reach was longer, his stab was faster. He saw no fear in the man approaching him. He felt no fear, but he felt the challenge before it was even said. No words were needed as the men looked each other up and down. Ull pointed to the deer. "Shall we skin it then?" And so it was. That evening, Clan Bashkna and Clan Morna for the very first time sat together. And they told each other stories of how they lived off the land, how they'd built their Fulloch Fia, how they had stayed in the house of a king the last winter instead of going back to the society they did not want to. Aid's eyes opened wide with a grin, and his brother, it was his brother after all, Conan. And the night went by with great stories of battles won, enemies vanquished, great deer and stags brought down. But for every story Clan Bashna told, Clan Morna brought up a bigger, greater boast. If one man was knocked down by Ull in a story, 10 men were knocked down by Aid, according to Conan, in the next story. If it was a deer Ull caught, Conan was sure, well, Aid caught 3 great stags with one single cast. The night stories had mirth to it, but they also had an edge. A slight edge, but an edge nonetheless. Still, Ull was fascinated to see these 2 fierce brothers bonded in Clan Morna. Wild, wilder than anyone he had seen before. And he walked through the forests with someone he had never really met before. Someone who sensed the liveness of the land just as he had. Who placed his hands on the trees and listened with all of his being to its beat and its thrum. Who spoke of how everything was interconnected, not poetically, but just simply. It's all there, isn't it? It's all together like. Ull had a way with words he knew, but this man had a straightforwardness he admired. And judging by the look of him, some of the stories may not have been overly exaggerated. He was a fierce warrior, there was no doubt. And when they went training together, they stayed together for those long, hot days in the summer. And they stayed and trained together, and they roamed and they hunted together. And when Ull was faster off the block and swifter through the trees, Aid was stronger. He wrestled a great stag down, jumping from a tree, wrestling it to the ground and breaking its neck. A story Ull told beautifully that night by the fireside, as Conan didn't need any exaggerating. Not that night, at least. North and south, east and west, they travelled over Ireland, and they began to recognise this hunger, this passion, this desire to stay in amongst the high-hilled places, the lonely forests, the beautiful waterways, the cliffs. But it gets cold, Conan said. Of course it does, Ull replied one night, when they all gathered, all listening to his words. Of course it does. That's why they want you to stay inside. That's why they trap you with comfort, with penance, with taxes, with duties and loyalties, so you can be warm at night by a fireside with cold stone surrounding you. They want to keep you aware that you feel cold. They don't want you feeling the earth under your feet. They don't want you in the wild places, because the land will speak to you then, and you'll know you belong here. He was off on another night, telling stories, inspiring those around him, as he always did. Aed and Conan revelled in it. So why would he go back, huh? Sure, can we just stay out the whole time? We'll defend the land anyway, against anyone. We're better than any army that they might go and train. It was true. Who'll knew it? They were the greatest fighting faction. They were training all of the time. And when housed in a king's hall, they would be loyal. They would be loyal with their strength as with their stories. If anyone needed an army, they could simply supply the force. When he offered this wisdom to the others, most agreed, except for Conan, who spoke in low, hushed tones with his brother. Why should we? After all, we're stronger than most anyway. Why don't we just take the castles? Ul could see his friend, who he now considered a close friend. He realised as close as brothers they'd become, being lured away to this idea of debauchery, lack of honour. You had to have honour, he reminded Aed. You have to have a clean heart. Your actions, they must go along with your words. And as strong as your limbs are, you must be able to recognise that that force should always be put in defence of the weaker ones. Not just to take what you want. Although he spoke truly and from his heart, Ul realised that Aed was not listening to most of what he said. Aed had a stubborn way about him, and when he had an idea in his head, Ul realised there was no talking sense to him. Not when Conan was there, muttering his mutterings in his ear anyway. So they went across the water for winter. He was worried to hear it, and time went by. Ul and his clan Bashna, they were housed in great king's halls in Connacht, where the wild, windswept landscape was cold, blustery and wet. But stories kept them alive at night, longing for the adventures of the lighter half, until word came to him that Clan Morna were doing exactly what he said not to do. They had ousted kings from their halls across the land of Britain. Every time he heard this, a fury rose up in Ul. This was not the way of the Fianna. This was not the way to commune with the land. This was not the way to rally true, honest and devout warriors to your cause. This was the way to draw bandits, to bring about chaos, to dismantle society. He didn't want to dismantle society, Ul thought. He just wanted to live outside of it. Let them build their castles, he thought. He'd defend the land and stand up for what was right. But every time he heard of Clan Morna doing it again, something rose up in Ul. And he sailed across the sea. And he took with him a greater faction each time. He went to Britain, and he ousted Clan Morna from a castle they had taken. He followed them to Scotland, all the way to High-Hill Alban. He ousted them from a castle they had taken and near burnt down. He went to Wales. They even went to France. When he came back, years had gone by. Ul had married. There was many women he lay with. There was many looking his way. The stories of Clan Morna, although he loved and had love for Aed, although Conan was trickier to love, he was still desperately disappointed they couldn't see it his way and align with Clan Bashna's morals. After all this time, it was simple. Cleanness of heart glinna in our cree, strength in our limb, nart in our neag, and actions to match the words, Bert the rare or Mriher. These were the honour code, the warrior's code, the motto that he lived by. And Aid always seemed to go against it, some way or another, not living with generosity in the winter months, but living with tenacious, rebellious desire and hunger and want for more. This was against what Ull fought for in the summer months. But then in the forest, he was hunting one day, and a woman ran past him faster than any deer he had seen. Running after her, he was sure it was a vision from the other world, but this woman was lithe and sweet and supple and so brilliant at moving, she ran with the deer of the forest. Ull placed down his spear, forgetting to hunt and run after them. He ran and watched. This woman was mesmerizing. He stayed that night in the forest, camping, waiting, hoping to catch another glimpse. And sure enough, she ran by, and he ran after her again. But each time she seemed to get away. Until finally, the third day, when she ran by him this time, he called. She simply called after him that he'd better catch up. And so he ran as fast as he could. And she seemed to slow, he thought, or allow him to catch up with her at least. She was definitely faster. She moved like one of the Tuatha. She had the blood of the ever-living ones running through her veins, he thought. Pale, emerald eyes, dark hair, a steely gaze that froze Cool's heart in his chest. Suddenly he longed for her like no one else he'd ever seen. When he caught her, well, he thought the chasing was sweet, but this catching was the sweetest thing he'd ever found. Myrna was her name. Her father, Taig, would not consent to marriage. She warned him. But Ull was well spoken. He was the son of a king, although he'd turned his back on society. He could still enter into the courts of the kings, and Concaid Cog knew his name. Taig would surely allow him to marry his daughter, he thought. And so he went to Taig Macanuada, Taig the Druid, the son of Nuada, who indeed had the blood of the ever-living ones and the magic of those Tuatha running through his veins. And a dark scowl came over his face when Ull asked for the hand of his daughter. Taig's face became a shadow. He snarled. Bitter words were spat at Ull. He couldn't believe the fury, the anger, the hatred in this man's voice. He called him a vagabond, a criminal, a tramp, and many more I won't repeat. Ull backed out the door of Taig Macanuada, and he turned and he saw Myrna, and they ran off together, despite Taig's anger. Now that was closing towards the end of the summer months. The light half the year was closing in, and Ull had no worries on him. He'd met the love of his life. He'd eloped with her into the high hills to the south, sunny southwest. He would find a king down there, someone to host Clan Bashna, and He hadn't heard from Clan Morna for a while until there they were, Aed and Conan, once more arriving back to Ireland, their heads ducked low. "We don't want to fight, we just want to agree on terms," Aed had said. They agreed the Fianna would be two factions. For those who wanted to live off the land and freely under Ull's guidance, they could do. Anyone who wanted to swear their allegiance to Clan Morna, Aed and Conan, they could do. It was someone's choice, after all. You weren't born into a Fiann, you had to ask permission to join one. The only difference was Aed was more reckless. He took what he wanted in the winter months. If there was a castle, they'd take the lodging, instead of asking permission. Ull gritted his teeth. He didn't want this. He nearly wanted to fight them for it. This was not the way he had dreamt the Fianna to be. But it was not the time for a fight. And Clan Morna were stronger now. If they'd returned, there was more of them. He could see that. He had maybe not been focusing as much on his own clan as he should have, having been running around with Myrna all the summer months. His faction had maybe gotten a bit sick of his womanizing and lack of training. He regretted that momentarily, but he still had the woman of his dreams next to him. And his sister, Baumel. She had reassured him that it would all be fine. No matter what happened, he would find a way. He always did. And so, they agreed to go their separate ways. His sister's voice ringing in his head. "Just don't bring it to a fight," she had warned him. And so, Clan Morna, well, they went to Con Caedcach, Con of the 100 Battles. And it was there that they offered their strength and their loyalty for the winter months to Con. And when Ull was down in the south with Myrna after running away from her father, Tig, they thought they'd settle in for a winter of hospitality, stories, singing, wait for the summer months to come back around, wait until Beotana, and maybe a baby boy, as he placed his hand on Myrna's belly, knowing the growing that was going on inside of her. He kissed her sweetly on the lips. But it wasn't long till a messenger came with a dark message for Ull. Tig had gone to Con Caedcach. He had demanded retribution for Ull stealing his daughter away. He demanded Con Caedcach send an army to destroy Ull and Clan Bashkna. Con had agreed to the Druid's demands. The Druid was one not to be dismissed. The Druid was the son of Nuada, and he had convinced Con Caedcach to send his army. His army was Clan Morna. And so, Clan Morna and Clan Bashkna agreed to go and meet at the Battle of Canuck.